Sergeant Zyx'taal of the Galactic Confederation Marines stared at the holographic battle map, his tentacles twitching with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The pulsing red dot representing the human no. The Deathworlder was still moving. Still, freaking, moving. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, his voice a blend of disbelief and barely suppressed laughter. "This has to be some sort of sick joke, right?" His second-in-command, Lieutenant Quarry, made a sound that could only be described as a snort gurgle. "If it is, Sarge, the universe has one hell of a sense of humor." The rest of the alien Marine squad huddled around the holomup, their expressions a comical mix of awe, horror, and what could only be described as what the actual fuckitude. They'd been hunting this lone human for 3 solar cycles now, ever since the poor bastard ship had crash-landed on this god-forsaken jungle planet. At first, they'd been cocky. After all, what chance did a single human have against a full squad of the Galactic Confederation's finest? They'd expected to wrap this up in a few hours, maybe a day tops. Oh, how wrong they'd been. "All right, you overgrown amoebas," Zyx'taal growled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's review our spectacular failures so far, shall we?" He waved a tentacle, and the holomup zoomed out, showing a series of red X's scattered across the terrain. Each X represented a point where they'd encountered and subsequently had their asses handed to them by the human. "Here's where we first cornered him," Zyx'taal said, pointing to an X near the crash site. "And here's where Private Gloop lost his lunch and his dignity." The Marines winced collectively, remembering how the human had somehow used a piece of the wreckage as an improvised weapon, sending poor Gloop flying into a tree with such force that he'd, well, let's just say it wasn't pretty. "Then we had this lovely spot," Zyx'taal continued, his voice rising in pitch as he struggled to contain his hysterical laughter, "where the human decided to play catch with our own plasma grenades. I particularly enjoyed the part where he yelled pull, before lobbing them back at us." Lieutenant Quarry raised a tentacle. "In our defense, Sarge, who could have predicted he'd be crazy enough to catch plasma grenades?" "Oh, I don't know," Zyx'taal replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe anyone who's ever heard the term Deathworlder before. But please, continue to dazzle me with your brilliant tactical insights, Lieutenant." Quarry's skin flushed a deep shade of embarrassed purple, and he lowered his tentacle. "Moving on to this delightful location," Zyx'taal said, highlighting another X where the human demonstrated his species' apparent immunity to our neurotoxins by using them as, what did he call it? Hot sauce. The squad collectively shuddered, remembering the horrifying sight of the human downing a vial of their most potent nerve agent, smacking his lips and declaring it zesty, but could use more kick. "And let's not forget yesterday's fiasco," Zyx'taal continued, his voice now a mixture of laughter and something approaching hysteria. "When we thought we finally had him cornered in that cave." The Marines shifted uncomfortably, recalling how they'd sealed off every exit, pumped in enough sedative gas to knock out a Kraxan beast, and then stormed in, it only to find the cave empty and a crude stick figure drawn on the wall, with the words "better luck next time, suckers," scrawled beneath it. "But now," Zyx'taal said, his voice suddenly serious as he zoomed in on the current red dot, "we come to our latest clusterfuck. So would someone care to explain to me how exactly this human is still moving after taking a direct hit from our heavy plasma cannon?" Silence fell over the group. They'd all seen it happen. The human had been caught in the open, no cover in sight. The cannon had fired, the plasma bolt had struck true, and for one glorious moment, they'd thought it was over. Then the smoke had cleared, revealing the human still standing, a sizable hole burned through his chest. And what had the insane Deathworlder done? He'd looked down at the wound, looked back up at them, and laughed. "Well," he'd said, his voice surprisingly cheerful for someone with a gaping chest wound, "that's going to leave a mark." And then he charged them, with a hole in his chest big enough to fit a Grixian melon. I don't understand," Sarge Private Slorback said, his voice quivering. "Our briefing said humans were Class 12 Deathworlders, but this is impossible." Zyx'taal turned all 4 of his eyes on the private, his expression a mixture of pity and amusement. "Oh, my sweet summer larva," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Allow me to enlighten you on the true nature of the beast we're dealing with." He waved a tentacle, and a holographic image of Earth appeared above the battle map. The planet looked innocuous enough: blue oceans, green and brown landmasses, swirling white clouds. But to the educated eye, it was a death trap of epic proportions. "This," Zyx'taal said, his voice taking on the tone of a particularly sarcastic professor, "is what humans call home. A planet so hostile, so unforgiving, that it makes our toughest training simulations look like a relaxing day at the Spore Spa. He zoomed in on various regions of the planet, highlighting them as he spoke. See these areas? Deserts hot enough to boil your innards. These? Frozen wastelands that would shatter you like cheap glass. Oh, and let's not forget these charming spots where the very ground occasionally decides to split open and spew molten rock. The Marines stared at the image, their expressions a mixture of horror and disbelief. But wait, Zyx'taal continued, his voice rising with mock excitement, there's more. The planet is constantly bombarded with radiation from its star. The atmosphere is laced with corrosive oxygen. And don't even get me started on the wildlife. He pulled up images of Earth's creatures, lions, bears, sharks, and more. These lovely critters. They're what humans consider normal. In fact, some of them keep smaller versions as pets. Private Zyx'taal made a sound that could only be described as a whimper. And the cherry on top of this delightful death Sunday, Zyx'taal said, his voice now a blend of awe and resignation. Humans are not content with merely surviving this hellscape. Oh no, they thrive in it. They've spread to every corner of their world, adapting to conditions that would kill any sane species. He paused, letting the information sink in. So to answer your question, Private, no, this isn't impossible. This is just another Tuesday for a human. The squad fell silent, the full weight of their situation finally sinking in. They weren't just hunting a Deathworlder. They were hunting a being that laughed in the face of certain death, that treated mortal wounds as minor inconveniences. So Lieutenant Quarble said, breaking the silence, what you're saying is, we're royally fucked. Zyx'taal turned to his second-in-command, a grim smile spreading across his face. Oh, my dear Lieutenant, fuck doesn't even begin to cover it. We're not just fucked, we're. He paused, searching for the right words before his eyes lit up with inspiration. We're as fucked as a Zlugnarian slime slug in a salt mine. We're as fucked as a Vexillian void whale in a stellar nursery. We're so monumentally, spectacularly, mind-bogglingly fucked that future generations will study our fuckery as a cautionary tale. The squad stared at their sergeant, a mixture of awe and terror on their faces. But fear not, my intrepid band of soon-to-be smears on the landscape, Zyx'taal continued, his voice taking on a manic edge, for we are the Galactic Confederation Marines. We do not go gentle into that good night. We rage against the dying of the light. Or, in this case, against the unkillable human who's probably planning to use our own limbs as impromptu clubs to beat us to death. He paused, realizing he'd perhaps let his enthusiasm get the better of him. That sounded more inspiring in my head. Just then, an alarm blared from the holomup. The red dot representing the human was moving again, and it was heading straight for their position. Well, ladies, gentlemen, and various states of matter in between, Zyx'taal said, his voice a mixture of resignation and hysterical laughter. It looks like our one-man apocalypse is coming to us. Any last words before we face our doom? Private Zyx'taal raised a trembling tentacle. I think I need to change my exoskeleton. Lieutenant Quarble snorted. Get in line, rookie. I've been holding it since that lunatic caught the plasma grenade. Zyx'taal looked at his squad, a strange mix of pride and pity welling up inside him. They were scared, yes, but they were still here, still ready to face whatever insanity the universe, or in this case, a single human, threw at them. All right, you magnificent bastards, he said, his voice softer now, almost fond. Let's give this Deathworlder a welcome he'll never forget. Assuming, of course, that anything we do actually registers as a threat to him. As the squad scrambled to their positions, setting up what would likely be hilariously inadequate defenses, Zyx'taal couldn't help but chuckle. If someone had told him a week ago that he'd be facing certain death at the hands of a single being from a backwater planet, he'd have laughed them out of the galaxy. Now he was just hoping their inevitable defeat would at least be interesting enough to make the news back home. The ground began to shake, trees in the distance toppling as someone approached. Zyx'taal took a deep breath, steadying himself for what was to come. Here we go, boys and girls, he muttered, a manic grin spreading across his face. Let's see if we can't give this human a run for his money, or at least trip him up a bit before he uses us as impromptu juggling balls. And with that, the final battle began. The first sign that things were about to go spectacularly, hilariously wrong was the sound. It wasn't the thunderous footsteps they'd expected, nor the war cry of a berserker charging into battle. No, it was whistling. A jaunty, upbeat tune that seemed wildly out of place in their current life or death situation. Is he whistling the theme from Galactic Gladiators? Lieutenant Quarble asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. Before anyone could answer, the trillion exploded. Literally, Trees went flying as if they were toothpicks, and through the shower of foliage and splinters strode the human. He looked well, worse for wear would be an understatement. His clothes were tattered, his skin covered in cuts and bruises, and oh yes, there was still that pesky hole in his chest where the plasma cannon had hit him. But his eyes were alive with a manic glee that sent shivers down the spines or spine equivalents of every Marine present. "Well, hello there," the human called out, waving cheerfully as if he'd just stumbled upon a neighborhood barbecue rather than a heavily armed alien squad. "Lovely day for a fight to the death, isn't it?" Zyx'taal, to his credit, managed to keep his voice steady as he replied, "Human, you are outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now, and we promise to make your death quick and relatively painless." The human tilted his head, considering this for a moment. Then he burst out laughing. Not a menacing laugh or an evil cackle, but a genuine belly laugh of pure amusement. "Oh my dear, what are you again, squids? Octopi, sentient jelly?" the human asked, wiping a tear from his eye. "That's adorable. Really it is, but let me counter with an offer of my own." He spread his arms wide, the motion causing a disturbing squelching sound from his chest wound. "How about you surrender, and I promise to only use half of you as makeshift weapons to beat the other half into submission." There was a moment of stunned silence, broken only by the sound of Private Zlorbak's whimpering softly. You can't be serious," Zyx'taal sputtered, his tentacles waving in agitation. "There are 12 of us, and only one of you." The human's grin widened, taking on a predatory edge. "Exactly. 12 of you, one of me. Seems hardly fair." He paused, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "Tell you what, I'll close my eyes and count to 10. That should even things up a bit, don't you think?" And with that, the human actually closed his eyes and began counting. 1, 2. The Marines looked at each other in disbelief. Was this really happening? 3, 4. "Sarge," Lieutenant Korblep whispered urgently. "What do we do?" 5, 6. Zyx'taal's mind raced. This was their chance. The human's eyes were closed. They could rush him, overwhelm him with sheer numbers. 7, 8. "On my mark," Zyx'taal hissed to his squad, tensing for action. 9. "No-ow," Zyx'taal roared, and the Marines charged forward as one, weapons at the ready. 10. The human's eyes snapped open, gleaming with anticipation. "Ready or not, here I come." What followed was less a battle and more a slapstick comedy routine. If slapstick comedies typically ended with multiple contusions, fractured exoskeletons, and existential crises, the human moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a being of his size, especially one with a gaping chest wound. He ducked and weaved through the Marines' attacks as if they were moving in slow motion, all while keeping up a running commentary that was equal parts terrifying and hilarious. "Oh, come on now," he chided, casually dodging a plasma blast that left a smoking crater in the ground behind him. "I've seen sedated sloths with better aim, and believe me, that's saying something." He grabbed Private Zlorbak by the tentacles and began spinning him around like an impromptu flail, using the unfortunate Marine to knock 3 of his squadmates flying. "We," the human cried out gleefully. "Always wanted to try my hand at tentacle juggling. How am I doing, Sarge? Olympic-level performance." Zyx'taal, who was at that moment trying to untangle himself from Lieutenant Korblep after a particularly spectacular collision, could only respond with a string of curses that would have made a Zarbloxian dock worker blush. The human skecked disapprovingly. "Language, Sarge. There might be impressionable larvae watching. Speaking of which." He paused in his whirlwind of destruction to address a thoroughly traumatized Private Zlorbak, who was now draped unceremoniously over a fallen log. "You okay there, buddy? Not too dizzy, I hope. Remember, it's all in the core. Gotta engage those abs, or whatever the equivalent is for you jellyfish folk. The battle, if it could even be called that, raged on. The Marines tried every tactic they knew, flanking maneuvers, coordinated attacks, even attempting to dogpile the human en masse. Nothing worked. It was like trying to nail jelly to a wall if the jelly was actively trying to turn you into a pretzel while cracking terrible puns. "Come on, folks," the human taunted, effortlessly tossing 2 Marines over his shoulders. "Then we're the pride of the Galactic Confederation. Right now, you're barely qualifying as the mild embarrassment of a small-town knitting circle." Zyx'taal, panting heavily and nursing what he was pretty sure was a dislocated tentacle, tried to rally his troops. "Regroup. Formation Delta 9. The human perked up at this. "Oh, Formation Delta 9. Sounds fancy. Is that the one where you all line up nicely, so I can bowl you over like squishy tentacled bowling pins." To the Marines' credit, they managed to form up into a tight defensive circle. To their dismay, the human seemed more amused than intimidated. "Oh, how cute," he cooed. "It's like a little octopus cuddle party. Mind if I join in?" Before anyone could react, the human had somehow inserted himself into the middle of their formation. He threw his arms around the nearest Marines in a bear hug that left them gasping for breath. "Group hug," he announced cheerfully. "Come on, don't be shy. Let's all get in on this. It's important to bond with your teammates, or, the guy who's currently turning you into living modern art sculptures." What followed was a whirlwind of flailing tentacles, muffled curses, and the occasional yelp of surprise as the humans systematically dismantled their formation from the inside out. It was less like a battle and more like watching a cat play with a ball of yarn if the yarn was alive, armed, and seriously reconsidering its life choices. As the dust settled, Zyx'taal found himself face down on the ground, one eye swollen shut, and pretty sure he was now bending in ways his species was never meant to bend. He looked up to see the human standing over him, that infuriating grin still plastered on his face. "Well, Sarge," the human said, offering a hand ready to call it quits, "or do you need another round of whack-a-marine to really drive the point home?" Zyx'taal stared at the offered hand, then at the human's face, then back at the hand. His mind, battered as it was, struggled to comprehend what was happening. This human had just single-handedly, quite literally at times, decimated his entire squad. He'd shrugged off injuries that would have killed any sane being, and now he was helping him up. "Why?" Zyx'taal managed to croak out. The human's grin softened slightly. "Why what? Why am I helping you up? Why did I fight you? Why is the sky blue? You're going to have to be more specific there, Sarge. I'm good, but I'm not a mind reader. But given how this day is going, I wouldn't be surprised if that was next on the list." Zyx'taal struggled to his feet, waving off the human's offered hand. He drew himself up to his full height, which, admittedly, still left him looking up at the towering Deathworlder. "Why," he began, then paused to spit out what he hoped wasn't a crucial part of his anatomy. "Why aren't you killing us?" Human blinked, looking genuinely surprised. "Kill you? Why would I do that? This is the most fun I've had in years." Fun. The word echoed in Zyx'taal's mind, bouncing around like a deranged ping-pong ball. Fun. This human, this unstoppable force of nature, had been treating their life or death struggle like some sort of demented game. But we've been trying to kill you for days," Zyx'taal sputtered, his tentacles waving in confused agitation. The human waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, look, no hard feelings, all right? I get it. You were just doing your job, hunting down the dangerous alien and all that jazz. I can respect that." He paused, looking around at the groaning, battered Marines scattered across the clearing. "Though between you and me, I think we might need to revisit who exactly is the dangerous alien in this scenario." Zyx'taal's mind reeled. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The human should be a rampaging monster, a mindless killing machine. Instead, he was cracking jokes, offering olive branches. It defied everything he'd been taught about Deathworlders. "I don't understand," Zyx'taal admitted, his voice small and confused. The human's grin returned, but this time it held a hint of sympathy. "Yeah, I get that a lot. Look, how about we start over?" He stuck out his hand again. "Hi, I'm Dave. Sorry about, the whole one-man army thing. I tend to get a bit carried away sometimes." Zyx'taal stared at the offered hand, then back at the human's at Dave's face. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out a tentacle and shook it. "Sergeant Zyx'taal," he introduced himself, still not quite believing what was happening. I'm sorry we tried to kill you." Dave laughed, a booming sound that seemed to shake the very trees. "No worries, mate. Water under the bridge, or, plasma bolts through the chest, as the case may be." He glanced down at the still gaping hole in his torso. "Speaking of which, you wouldn't happen to have a Band-Aid, would you? This is starting to sting a bit." And just like that, the absurdity of the situation hit Zyx'taal like a runaway cargo hauler. Here he was, shaking hands or tentacles with a being that had just wiped the floor with his entire squad, a being that was treating a mortal wound him like a minor inconvenience. He couldn't help it. He started to laugh. It began as a chuckle, then grew into a full-blown laugh. And before he knew it, Zyx'taal was doubled over, tentacles clutching his midsection as he howled with laughter. Dave joined in, his booming laughter mixing with Zyx'taal's higher-pitched trills. The rest of the squad, those who were still conscious anyway, stared in bewilderment at the sight of their sergeant and the human laughing like old friends after a particularly raucous night out. Lieutenant Quarry, nursing a lump on his head the size of a small moon, sidled up to Zyx'taal. Sarge, are you okay? Did you hit your head? Should we be concerned about brain damage?" Zyx'taal waved a tentacle, trying to catch his breath. "I'm fine, Lieutenant. Just realizing the absurdity of it all." Dave, still chuckling, clapped a hand on Quarry's shoulder, nearly sending the alien sprawling. "Come on, Lieutenant. Lighten up. Life is too short to be all doom and gloom, especially when you've just had your tentacles handed to you by a walking, talking anatomy lesson." Quarry looked from Dave to Zyx'taal and back again, his expression a perfect picture of utter confusion. I think I need to lie down." "Probably a good idea," Dave agreed cheerfully. "In fact, why don't we all take a breather? I don't know about you folks, but near-death experiences always leave me famished. Anyone up for a bite to eat? I make a mean campfire stew. Though, you might want to check if it's compatible with your biology first. Wouldn't want to add accidental poisoning to today's list of misadventures." And so, in a turn of events that would have made any sensible betting entity in the galaxy go bankrupt, the battered and bruised Galactic Confederation Marines found themselves sitting around a hastily made campfire, sharing a meal with the very being they'd been trying to capture or kill just hours before. Dave, true to his word, had whipped up a stew using some local vegetation, and what he claimed were emergency rations from his crashed ship. The Marines, after some hesitant sniffing and scanning with their medical tricorders, cautiously tried the concoction. "This is surprisingly not terrible," Private Zlorbax admitted, slurping up the stew with a tentacle. "High praise indeed," Dave chuckled, stirring the pot. "I'll have you know this recipe won the most likely to not cause immediate digestive distress award at the last Intergalactic Culinary Disaster Relief Cook-Off." Zyx'taal, who had been quiet for a while, finally spoke up. "I still don't understand. Why aren't you angry with us? We hunted you, shot at you, tried to kill you repeatedly." Dave shrugged, wincing slightly as the motion pulled at his chest wound. "Life's too short for grudges, Sarge. Besides, this whole chase, it's been the most excitement I've had in years. Gets the blood pumping, you know." But we shot you," Zyx'taal sputtered, pointing at Dave's chest, "with a plasma cannon." Dave glanced down at the hole in his chest as if he'd forgotten it was there. "Oh, this old thing. It's just a flesh wound. Give it a day or two, it'll buff right out." The Marines exchanged incredulous looks. Just a flesh wound. The human had a hole in his chest big enough to fit a small child, and he was treating it like a minor inconvenience. How Lieutenant Quarry began, then paused, seemingly unsure how to phrase his question. "How are you still alive?" Dave grinned, a twinkle in his eye. "Well, Lieutenant, when a mommy human and a daddy human love each other very much." "That's not what I meant," Quarry interrupted, his skin flushing a deep purple. I know, Dave chuckled. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. Something about accelerated healing, enhanced durability, and a healthy dose of too stubborn to die. It's a human thing." He leaned back, looking up at the alien sky. "You know, it's funny. Back on Earth, I was just an average Joe. Nothing special. But out here," he gestured broadly at the jungle around them. "Out here, I'm suddenly this unstoppable force of nature. All because I grew up on a planet that apparently qualifies as the galaxy's most extreme theme park." The Marines listened, fascinated despite themselves. This human, this Dave, was unlike anything they'd ever encountered. He was powerful, yes, but also kind, funny, definitely insane, but in an oddly endearing way. "So, what happens now?" Zyx'taal asked, voicing the question that was on everyone's mind. Dave scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well, I suppose that depends on you folks. I'm guessing let's all be friends and forget this whole trying to kill each other thing isn't an option in your official playbook." Zyx'taal shook his head. "Our orders were clear. Capture or eliminate the dangerous alien life form." Dave nodded sagely. "And I don't suppose there's a clause in there for in case said alien life form turns out to be a charming and incredibly handsome fellow who makes a mean campfire stew." Despite himself, Zyx'taal felt a chuckle escape. "I'm afraid not." "Pity." Dave sighed dramatically. "Your bureaucrats really should learn to plan for every contingency." "All right then, let's think outside the box, or outside the exoskeleton as the case may be." He stood up, pacing around the campfire as he thought aloud. "You can't let me go because orders. I can't let you capture or kill me because, well, I'm rather attached to the whole being alive and free thing. Bit of a pickle, isn't it?" The Marines watched him pace, their eyes following him like spectators at a particularly confusing tennis match. "Oh," Dave exclaimed suddenly, snapping his fingers. "I've got it. What if now, bear with me here, what if I captured you?" There was a moment of stunned silence, broken only by the crackling of the campfire and the distant calls of alien wildlife. "You want to capture us?" Lieutenant Crarblep asked slowly, as if trying to make sure he'd heard correctly. "Exactly." Dave beamed. "Think about it. You go back to your superiors. Tell them you encountered a highly advanced, incredibly dangerous alien being," said being in an impressive display of tactical genius and raw power. "Managed to subdue your entire squad and take you captive." He was really getting into it now, gesticulating wildly as he laid out his plan. But then, in an unexpected turn of events, this alien, let's call him Dave, has a nice ring to it, decides to open diplomatic channels. He releases you as a gesture of good faith with a message for your leaders. He's interested in peaceful cooperation, cultural exchange, the whole shebang. Zyx'taal blinked rapidly, his mind struggling to keep up. But that's not what happened at all. Dave waved a hand dismissively. "Details, details. The broad strokes are there. You encountered me, there was a conflict, and now we're talking peace. The rest is just creative storytelling." The Marines looked at each other, a mix of confusion, disbelief, and though they'd never admitted, a growing sense of admiration on their faces. It's so crazy it might actually work," Private Zlorbax muttered. "That's the spirit." Dave clapped the private on the back, nearly sending him face first into the stew pot. "Sorry about that. Still getting used to the whole super strength thing. Anyway, what do you say, Sarge? Fancy being part of the greatest diplomatic breakthrough in recent galactic history?" Zyx'taal looked at his battered squad, then back at Dave. The human stood there, grinning like a lunatic, a hole in his chest, proposing what had to be the most insane plan he'd ever heard. And yet, "All right," Zyx'taal found himself saying, hardly believing the words coming out of his own mouth. "All right, let's do it." Dave's grin, if possible, grew even wider. "Fantastic. Oh, this is going to be great. Just one tiny favor, though." "What's that?" Zyx'taal asked, suddenly wary. Dave's eyes twinkled with mischief. "When you're recounting the epic battle that led to your capture, could you maybe mention that I did all of it while whistling the theme from Galactic Gladiators? And I feel like that really adds a certain je ne sais quoi to the whole thing." And as the alien Marines burst into laughter, a mixture of hysteria, relief, and genuine amusement, Zyx'taal realized that the universe was a far stranger and more wonderful place than he'd ever imagined. Here, on this forgotten jungle planet, a group of alien Marines had not only failed to capture a Deathworlder, but had somehow ended up sharing a meal and hatching a crazy plan with him. It was insane. It was unprecedented. It was probably going to get him court-martialed. But as he watched Dave regaling his squad with increasingly outlandish tales of life on Earth, Zyx'taal couldn't bring himself to care. As something told him this was just the beginning of a very strange, very interesting new chapter in galactic history. And who knew? Maybe, just maybe, the Galactic Confederation wasn't ready for Hurricane Dave. But by the stars, it was certainly going to be fun to watch. As the twin suns of the alien world began to set, casting a surreal glow over the makeshift camp, Zyx'taal found himself raising his cup of stew in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of resignation and excitement. "And to making the galaxy a whole lot more interesting," Dave added, raising his own cup with a wink. The rest of the squad joined in, their tentacles raised high, cups of questionable stew slushing precariously. As they drank, Zyx'taal couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of it all. Here they were, toasting to new beginnings with a being they'd been trying to kill mere hours ago. As the night wore on, the impromptu celebration took on a life of its own. Dave, it turned out, was a natural storyteller, regaling the Marines with tales of Earth that sounded too outlandish to be true, and yet, given what they'd witnessed of this human's capabilities, they couldn't quite bring themselves to disbelieve him entirely. "And that's why you should never, ever challenge a kangaroo to a boxing match," Dave concluded, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. "Unless, of course, you enjoy the taste of your own teeth." Private Zlorbax, who had been listening with rapt attention, tentacles curled around his knees like a child at story time, raised an appendage. But why would anyone challenge one of these kangaroos in the first place?" Dave grinned. "Ah, well, you see, sometimes humans get these things called ideas after consuming certain liquids. We like to call it liquid courage, but liquid stupidity might be more accurate." Lieutenant Crarblep, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "I still don't understand. How can a planet produce beings like you?" He gestured vaguely at Dave, particularly at the still gaping chest wound that seemed to bother the human not at all. Dave's grin softened into something more contemplative. "It's not just the planet, you know. Though Earth is a real piece of work, I'll give you that. It's more about the attitude, I think." He leaned back, looking up at the alien stars twinkling overhead. Humans were stubborn. Ridiculously, illogically stubborn. Tell us something's impossible, and we'll break our backs trying to prove you wrong. Tell us we can't survive somewhere, and we'll not only survive, we'll build a bloody luxury resort there. The Marines exchanged glances, a mixture of awe and disbelief on their faces. But surely, Zyx'taal interjected, there must be limits. Even you can't just ignore biology. Physics. Dave chuckled, patting his chest wound absently. Oh, we don't ignore them. We just negotiate with them. Aggressively. Look at it this way, every other species in the galaxy evolved to fit their environment, right? The Marines nodded. This was basic xenobiology. Well, Dave continued, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Humans decided that was for chumps. Instead of adapting to our environment, we adapted our environment to us. Too cold. We invented fire. Too hot, air conditioning. Not enough food, we'll figure out how to grow it in places it has no business growing. Hell, we even looked at the vast, airless void of space and thought, yeah, we can work with that. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Want to know the real secret of humanity's success? The Marines leaned in, tentacles twitching with anticipation. We're too dumb to know when to quit, Dave said with a wink, and just smart enough to make our stupidity work for us. There was a moment of silence as the aliens processed this. Then, slowly, incredulously, they began to laugh. It started with a snort from Private Zlorbax, then a chuckle from Lieutenant Korblub, and soon the entire squad was howling with laughter, tentacles waving in the air. Zyx'taal, wiping tears from his eyes, managed to gasp out, So you're saying the secret to becoming an unstoppable galactic force is being too stubborn to realize you shouldn't be. Dave spread his arms wide, wincing only slightly at the pull on his chest wound. Welcome to humanity, my friends, where the rules are made up and the laws of nature are more like guidelines. As the laughter died down, replaced by a comfortable silence punctuated only by the crackle of the campfire and the strange calls of alien wildlife, Zyx'taal found himself thinking. This human, this Dave had single-handedly rewritten everything he thought he knew about the universe. And yet somehow, it all made a twisted kind of sense. You know, Zyx'taal said slowly, I think the Galactic Confederation might be in for quite a shock when humanity really starts making its presence known. Dave's grin turned positively feral. Oh, my dear Sergeant, you have no idea. If you think I'm a handful, just wait until you meet the rest of us. We've got philosophers who can tie your tentacles in knots with their arguments, engineers who look at the laws of physics as a personal challenge, and artists who can make you question the very nature of reality with a flick of a brush. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a stage whisper. And don't even get me started on our politicians. They could sell ice to a Phrygian and convince them it was a hot commodity. The Marines shuddered collectively at the thought. If this one human could cause so much chaos, what would an entire planet of them do to the galactic status quo? As the night wore on and the twin moons of the alien world climbed high in the sky, the unlikely group continued to share stories, jokes, and increasingly outlandish plans for the future. Somehow, without anyone quite realizing how it happened, what had started as a deadly game of cat and mouse had transformed into the beginnings of a most unusual friendship. Finally, as the first hints of dawn began to color the horizon, Dave stood up, stretching in a way that made his wounds gape alarmingly. Well, folks, it's been a blast, but I think it's time we put our plan into action. You've got a Galactic Confederation to shock, and I've got a one-man diplomatic mission to prepare for. Zyx'taal nodded, rising to his feet, or the closest equivalent for his species, agreed. Though I still can't quite believe we're doing this. Dave clapped him on the shoulder, thankfully remembering to moderate his strength this time. Believe it, Sarge. We're about to make history. Or at least give some poor galactic historian a real headache trying to make sense of all this. One by one, the Marines stood, gathering their equipment and preparing to leave. There was an awkward moment as they realized they weren't quite sure how to say goodbye to someone who had been their sworn enemy just a day ago. Dave, sensing the tension, grinned and spread his arms wide. Come on then, bring it in. Group hug. Before anyone could protest, they found themselves enveloped in a massive, slightly bloody embrace. It was awkward, it was bizarre, and it was, Zyx'taal had to admit, strangely heartwarming. As they broke apart, Dave fixed each of them with a serious look. Now remember, when you report back, really sell it. I want to hear about how I single-handedly fought off your entire squad while quoting Shakespeare and doing backflips. Extra points if you can work in something about me taming a local predator and riding it into battle. Lieutenant Cor Blape raised a tentacle hesitantly, but none of that actually happened. Dave winked. Details, my dear Lieutenant. The universe runs on stories, and this is going to be one for the ages. With final handshakes or tentacle shakes all around, the Marines prepared to depart. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Zyx'taal turned back for one last look. Dave stood there, silhouetted against the rising alien sun, the hole in his chest somehow making him look more heroic rather than less. He raised a hand in farewell, that infuriating, infectious grin still plastered on his face. "See you around the galaxy, Sarge," he called out. "And remember, if anyone asks, I was at least 10 feet tall and breathing fire." Shaking his head in a mixture of exasperation and amusement, Zyx'taal turned and led his squad into the jungle. As they made their way back to their ship, he couldn't help but feel that the universe had just become a much larger, much stranger, and infinitely more interesting place. Somewhere behind them, carried on the alien wind, they could hear the faint sound of whistling. It was, unmistakably, the theme from Galactic Gladiators. Zyx'taal chuckled to himself. The Galactic Confederation had no idea what was coming. But one thing was for certain, with humanity entering the galactic stage, things were about to get very interesting indeed. As their ship broke atmosphere, leaving the jungle planet behind, Zyx'taal found himself humming along to the Galactic Gladiators' theme. He caught himself, shook his head, and then with a mental shrug, continued humming anyway. After all, if you can't beat them, join them. And something told him that trying to beat humanity was going to be a losing proposition for the rest of the galaxy. The adventures of Dave the Deathworlder and the bemused alien Marines were just beginning, and the galaxy would never be the same again,